Hello, my name is Ivo Vegter, and welcome to another episode of Amped, the radio edition of my weekly Daily Maverick columns. You can find links to these talks, as well as to my other work, at ivo.co.za. That's ivo.co.za. You wouldn't be surprised to learn that there are schools of magic in South Africa. After all, someone has to teach would-be astrologers, sangomas, and fortune-tellers the tricks of the trade. But it is more alarming to learn that real universities participate in the charade. Let's talk about that this week, shall we? If you ever want to be inundated with magical thinking, just get ill. I had the misfortune to wind up in hospital recently, where I had the good fortune of being treated by qualified experts in medical science. They impressed me from the outset because they refused to believe a word I told them. They did not let me self-diagnose. They did not let me self-prescribe. In return, I did them the courtesy of not wasting their time by quoting Wikipedia. I was not paying them for an amateur opinion. The doctors used sophisticated scientific tests and deductive reasoning to rule out the more worrying possibilities. Once they knew what they could and could not conclude about what ailed me, they proceeded with treatment that has been tested countless times in properly constructed, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. The treatment included pharmaceuticals, of course, but also instructions concerning diet, lifestyle, and exercise, as well as a program for reducing the dose and cost of drugs over time. I'm not saying it would be a good idea for you to do daily cardiovascular exercise, my doctor memorably told me. Consider it a prescription. This struck me as a sensibly holistic way to approach disease. After all, many things influence the complex organism that is a living human. There were many possible causes for my illness and many possible contributors to getting better. However, well-meaning people always volunteer unsolicited advice, and when some of them advised me to seek holistic treatment, they meant something entirely different. Besides conventional medicine, as they call science, they wanted me to consider alternative medicine, which is their name for quackery ranging from Reiki to homeopathy. Now don't get me wrong, I'm perfectly open-minded. I have nothing against natural remedies, provided that those remedies have been scientifically proven to work. For example, I will gladly take a tincture prepared from the bark of a willow tree, if I needed an anticoagulant or a fever remedy. Doctors call this herbal remedy aspirin. The Australian artist and skeptic Tim Minchin uses the aspirin example in a brilliant sketch entitled Storm. If you haven't yet seen it, Google it. In Storm, Minchin says, alternative medicine has either not been proved to work or been proved not to work. Do you know what they call alternative medicine that's been proved to work? Medicine. And it appears I was lucky to find real doctors at the hospital. In South Africa, some so-called doctors get taught magical quackery, and by real universities to boot. End up at the wrong clinic, and you might get prescribed water for serious diseases. Ariane Mina, a British visitor to South Africa, blogged about her alarming experience at a clinic in KwaZulu-Natal. Not only did doctors with master's degrees from the Durban University of Technology prescribe homeopathic remedies, but patients believed that they were cured by the homeopathy, instead of by the real medicine that they were also taking. It's a great racket, of course, selling overpriced water to gullible people. But I wouldn't say it's a sort of ethical thing that a doctor ought to be doing. Again, I should be clear. I have nothing against the idea that like cures like. I do, after all, believe that vaccination works. But homeopathy does not work like vaccines do. In fact, belief in the magic of homeopathy is inversely correlated with belief in the science of vaccines. Homeopathy's law of similars is nothing but sympathetic magic. I also do not object to studying ancient wisdom in the hope of learning scientific truths from them. It is certainly plausible that some traditional law has a basis in scientific fact, and mining such historical knowledge seems a worthy avenue of inquiry. But some of it really was just ignorance. The musings of an 18th century quack named Samuel Hahnemann, who did not know germs or viruses existed and did not subject his theories to anything we would recognize as objective clinical tests, do not constitute knowledge. Not everything that is charming and old must be true, and not every possible hypothesis is valid. Credible universities ought to teach their students the difference between science and pseudoscience, instead of cloaking pseudoscience in academic respectability. The notion that a doctor ought to consider the totality of a patient's well-being, including psychological and environmental factors, is spot on. But despite the innocent description of homeopathy on the University of Johannesburg website as a method of healthcare that focuses on using natural principles in the treatment of disease, in which the approach is holistic, whereby all aspects of the individual are considered before selecting treatment, is not all homeopathy claims to do. The fundamental principles of homeopathy are flagrantly unscientific and unreasonable. Besides the law of similars, let's consider the law of infinitesimal doses. It says that the potency of a drug increases the more it is diluted. This is based on the ludicrous idea that a solvent, usually water or alcohol, has memory of a substance, even when it has been diluted so much that no trace of the original substance can possibly remain. A typical dilution, advocated by Hahnemann himself, is 30 C, which is equivalent to 1 in 10 to the 60. That's a 1 with 60 zeros. That works out to about 1 atom in an amount of liquid equivalent to the volume of 1,000 suns. And I am not exaggerating. If that kind of chemistry makes you think nonsense, you are just being terribly polite. A homeopath once explained to me that water has a crystal structure, despite its fairly obvious liquid state and the turbulence induced by quaffing it. Other quacks invoke words that sound impressive to lay people, like nanotechnology or biophotonics or quantum physics, to make it appear that they have a clue, but they don't. Homeopaths imagine water remembers only the herbal infusion with which it was doped, and not the radioactivity, pathogens and poisons that it encountered the last time it went through the sewage plant. Presumably that is because the memory of the herbs is activated by a mystical ritual called succussion, which involves stamping a vial of ordinarily forgetful water against a special piece of leather stuffed with horsehair 10 times. If you lack such an instrument, you can use the palm of your hand. Such ritualistic appeals to magic and claims that modern science simply doesn't know everything should be grounds for deep skepticism, and I use that phrase only to avoid stronger words for nonsense. Study after study have concluded that there is no clinical evidence that homeopathy is more effective than a placebo in the treatment of any particular condition.